But I got a confession to make with you today. And that is that when I play the game of Monopoly, I am not a pastor. In fact, when I play the game of Monopoly, I am not even married to my wife because this game is called Monopoly, right? It's mono, it's one, it's me, right? It's all about me in that moment, right? And if you've ever played the game of Monopoly, you probably played it as a child, but have you ever played it as an adult? Because I think actually it was designed for adults. If you actually think about the game of Monopoly as an adult, and if you play it with adults and as an adult, you actually understand what a property tax is. You actually understand the elements of what this game is all about. And so it is so fun and fascinating. And I love this game of Monopoly. But here's the thing about the game of Monopoly, that there are a lot of rules. And in fact, there are actually a lot of myths to the rules of the games of Monopoly. So what I want to do today is I want to actually demystify some of these myths. I think it's my life mission to do this because I love this game so much. And it will change your life today. If you hadn't take anything else from the sermon, you'll take away some of these myths of Monopoly. All right, so here's the first one. The first one is when you are in jail, you cannot collect rent. This is false. In fact, you actually want to go into jail sometimes because everybody has built on top of their properties with houses and hotels that you don't want to land on them. And so the only safe place is actually in jail, and you're sitting there collecting rent when they land on your property, okay? So that's the first myth. The second myth is this: you can only build houses and hotels on your turn. That's false too. In fact, you can build it at any time. The best strategy is actually right before somebody comes towards you, right, and they're about to roll and they're about to come to your lane or your section of property. You say, wait, you build your houses and your property right before they roll, and then they roll, and then they land, and they die, and then all the money comes to you, and you win, right? So that's the rules of Monopoly. If you read the rules of Monopoly, you can do it at any time. Here's the third one. You got to pass go once before you buy property. That's false too. You can buy property at any time. In fact, pro tip is that any time you land on property that someone else does not own and you have money, you buy, right? Because you leverage that property. It's all about acquiring more and more. And then here's the last one, maybe the most common. All taxes are put into the middle of the board, and if you land on free parking, you get the whole pot. That's not true either. In fact, some people actually start with $500 in the middle of it just to sweeten the pot. Did anybody else do that, right? That's called a house rule, right? That's not the rules of Monopoly, but you actually do that and you get all that money, but actually free parking is actually just that. It's just free parking. You don't get anything and you don't have to give anything. In fact, free parking is actually the most desirable spot sometimes because you don't want to hit on someone else's houses, okay? So as you can see, I'm a little bit passionate about Monopoly and the myths of Monopoly. And there are a lot of myths. In fact, there's a lot of myths when it comes to our lives. We're in a series called Life on Mission. And specifically in Life on Mission, we've been talking about gather purposely and serving selflessly and connecting deeply. But today we're going to talk about giving generously. Leave it to the guest pastor to speak on money, right? And we're talking about giving generously, and specifically, if there's any myths about anything, there are myths about money, because there is a lot of things that we understand about money or think about money. And if you are been following Jesus for a very long time here, or maybe you are here for the first time today, or maybe you came here today and you're a little bit more skeptical. And I'm so glad that you're here, because what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at the way that God sees it. And I believe that there's some takeaways for all of us. There's some transferable principles that we can take away that I think is going to be really helpful for all of us. So have you heard these myths about money? Here's the first one. The first one is this: having more money will make me happier. Having more money will make me happier. Now, if this was truly the case, then the richest people in the world would actually be the happiest people in the world. And we know that that's not true. In fact, no society has as much stuff as we do. We have so much stuff. We acquire so much stuff. We fill our houses with stuff, and we buy more and more stuff, and so the stuff actually gets pushed in our closet, and the closet stuff gets pushed into our garage. And when our garages get filled, we have garage sales, and we put it on Facebook Marketplace so that we can get more money and more room to buy more stuff, right? This is how it happens. We get more because we think that, as society and media has told us, that getting more will bring us more happiness. But actually, more only brings more. It doesn't bring happiness many times. In fact, more just wants more many times. Here's the second thing. Having more money will give me security. Having more money will give me security. Stuff is interesting, isn't it? Because you acquire all this stuff so that it will serve you well, right? That's our purpose in desiring all this stuff and getting all this stuff. But what happens is that we actually spend an absurd amount of money actually dealing with this stuff, moving this stuff, storing this stuff, protecting this stuff, insuring this stuff. And what was actually designed to serve us, we actually are serving it now. See, the bigger your house is, the better your community is, the more valuable your possessions are. The truth is that we need to build more walls and we'll have more alarms and buy more insurance to make sure that we can cover, because sometimes we get possessed by our possessions. In fact, I want to say this, that if you can't give something away, you no longer own it. It owns you. And that's the reality of so many things that we do when we acquire these things in our lives. We're infected by this major epidemic called affluenza. And affluenza just is this modern plague of materialism. I think a lot of us are really in it, and it is killing us. In fact, all these things that God has given to us, they're not bad in and of itself. In fact, they're agnostic by itself. But the reality is that when these things were actually to be given to us so that we can use them for God, they actually become our God in the process. So stuff doesn't actually give you security. God is the only one that gives you security. Or here's the next one. Having more money will give me value or importance. Having more money will give me more value or importance. But our self-worth is actually not our net worth. That is not to be connected. In fact, if I base my worth on the value of the things that I possess, then my worth is no more valuable than the value of my possessions. And we know what the value of our possessions do, right? They depreciate in value. The moment you take it off the lot, the moment you buy something, actually it depreciates. And so we have this the constant need to upgrade our lives so that way we can be of worth. And yet, the truth is, we need to place our value and our worth actually in things that transcends time. So, your self-worth is not your net worth. Your self-worth is actually God worth, what God says that you are worth. And He gave Jesus and His life for you, and that's worth a lot. And so we need to remember that it is our trust and it is what God sees in us. And then here's the last myth, the fourth one, that having more money will allow me to give more and be more generous. Having more money will allow me to give more and be more generous. And I wish this was true. But many times, this is not true, because what we find is that actually when our income increases, our lifestyle increases as well. How many times have you said in your past life, you said, well, if I just made $10,000 more, if I just made $20,000 more, we'd just be set. And the reality is that you're in the same position now because you're increasing your lifestyle along with your income. And that's what happens in our day. And so do we really think that living a life of adding and acquiring and accumulating and accomplishing and all those things that we do along the way, that all of a sudden when we have the most money that we're going to be generous with that money? Because the path of acquisition is hard to lead to generosity. The truth is that there's not enough money in the entire world to satisfy a heart that wants more. There's not. So you might have heard these myths before. Maybe you believe these myths. I sure have, and I've bought into these myths. And maybe we would say, okay, now we believe in the truths more so than the myths, and yet at the same time, maybe some of our actions actually don't follow suit with what we believe because we're living in a world that makes us creep back into this grip on the world that it has for us. And so what we need to be reminded of is not the myths, but actually the truths that we can hang on our happiness and our value and our security on. So today, I would love for you to turn to your Bibles to Mark chapter 12. If you don't have it, you can follow up on the screens. And Mark chapter 12 is actually a very common story that you might have heard of. And you probably have heard of. And as you're turning there, I'll tell you a little bit about the background, the context of what's going on here. But this is actually at the end of Jesus' ministry. And he is now doing this final teaching, and so he goes into the temple. And as he goes into the temple, he's taking his disciples with him to show them something, and he takes them to the temple treasury part of the temple. And in that temple treasury, there was these things called receivers, and there was about 13 of these things. And as this was a receiver, the people would actually come and they would actually give their offering or their gifts to God. In fact, during this time, it was a Passover time. And so there was actually a lot of people coming back into the hometown to be able to give their offering and to give their gifts to God. So this is actually what is the setting of this passage that we're about to read. Verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite of the place where the offerings were being put and watched the crowds putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. And so Jesus and the disciples were watching this. Now, they were off to the side. They were actually on the opposite side of the rooms. They were watching what was happening. In fact, that word watching literally means look intently. Look intently, because Jesus had a purpose for what was going on. He had a reason for why they were actually doing this and why they were supposed to be watching so intently to this. And so Scripture actually tells us that the rich people were putting in large amounts. Question, how do we know that they were putting large amounts? I mean, were they announcing their gifts? Did somebody ask them, hey, how much did you put in there? Right? Well, we have to remember back in that time that they weren't using paper currency. The only currency that they had was coins. And so they had gold coins and silver coins and copper coins and bronze coins. So a gold coin represented about $300 worth. A silver coin, or also known as a denarius, that was actually worth a person's wage, one day's wage. That's what it was worth. And so they had all of these different type of coins. And so what they would do is they would bring their offering, and then they would take it to the receptors, and then they would drop in, and it would sound like this. And that's how you'd know that actually people are giving large amounts. And so if someone was to give $500, I mean, it probably sounded something like that. If somebody gave like $1,000, I mean, it probably sounded something like that. And so people were actually giving. And so somebody who gave about $10,000, I mean, they were giving a lot of money, and they would be able to hear this, and they are actually saying, wow, there's actually a lot of people who are putting a lot of money in there, and they knew this because of this. So imagine this scene. Imagine the scene that they just saw this person put $10,000 into this receptor. And they're thinking, they're looking at each other, and they're like, I can't believe this. Jesus, I mean, can you believe this? And then as they're thinking that, there's another person that comes. And another person coming, and they're bringing their bag. In fact, they're actually saying, excuse me, pardon me, excuse me, because Matthew 6 actually says that these people would actually put a show on for other people to make it known that they were actually giving large gifts. And so, excuse me, pardon me, excuse me, and working their way into the crowd. And this person starts to actually give his gift. And as he's giving his gift, they are in awe because he's giving so much, and they just continually giving and continually giving and continually giving and continually giving and continually giving. And just when you think he's done, it's like, okay, he actually gives even more and more and more, and they are just in shock. They cannot believe it. The disciples are just looking at each other, and they look at Jesus and says, did you see that? And Jesus is not even paying attention. In fact, he's actually looking at something else. Look what it says in this next verse. It says, verse 42, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Here comes a raggedy woman humbly bringing 2 coins that she had predetermined in advance. And she actually comes to the receptor, into the temple treasury, and it sounded maybe like this. And they're probably thinking and looking at each other. But Jesus uses this story to teach the disciples something that they would never forget. Don't miss this. Verse 43. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more in the treasury than all the others." More? More? I mean, do you know math, Jesus? Did you watch what happened? Did you hear what was going on? Jesus, what are you talking about more? And Jesus looks to them and teaches them a valuable lesson on generosity and says this, verse 44, "They gave out of their wealth, but she gave out of her poverty, put everything in, all that she had to live on." Now, here's what Jesus knew that day that nobody else knew. Not only did he know the actual amounts of what people gave, but Jesus actually knew the income in which they gave it from. And that was something that he knew that everybody else didn't know. In fact, he knew what percentage of their income that they were giving to in that offering, not just the actual amount. And so I believe that this is the principle that God is teaching the disciples and God is teaching us today. And that's what this is. It means that God measures our generosity based on a percentage, not an amount. God bases generosity on a percentage, not on an amount. In fact, we get this messed up all the time because amounts actually get headlines. If we think about it, the hundreds of $1,000s, the $1 million, the $1 billion toward this relief or towards this effort or those type of things, that's what makes the headlines. But in the economy of God, percentages actually make the difference. Because a percentage actually tells you about something. That's why we have this story in the Bible. That's why Jesus is actually using this as an opportunity to teach his disciples. See, Jesus knew that the rich people were putting in their large amounts. They were doing it, giving out of their wealth, meaning out of their surplus, out of their extra, out of something that wasn't even a sacrifice for them. But the widow made a decision and gave out of her poverty, meaning this is all she had. She left no room to trust in anything else except for God. And as that was happening, it was actually about sacrifice. It was actually about trust. The difference between the rich people and the widow was that the rich people gave out of the remainder of what they had, and this widow gave as a reminder of who God is. That's why our giving should always, always be a reminder of who we trust, not a remainder of what we have. It's easy to give an amount. It's harder to trust that God will take care of my needs when I give a percentage of everything that I have. And that's what this widow was doing. Now, we don't know the end of the story. We have no idea what happened to the widow. I've always wondered, did she survive after giving everything? Was that irresponsible of her? And yet at the same time, if this story is in the Bible, if Jesus used this as an illustration, my best educated guess is that she was honored and she was taken care of. Because she trusted in God. She was faithful with the small, and God probably entrusted her with more. Because you reap what you sow. Because when you give, you receive. This is the law of the harvest. Now, I was, many, many years ago, when my kids were very little, I wanted to teach them this law of the harvest. And so they came back from Halloween with all of their candy that they had gotten so much. And they put it all in the living room and laid it all out. So much candy, more candy than any child should ever consume, right? And they got this all on the living room. I said, I want to teach this principle to them. And so it's time to tithe to daddy, right? It's time to give a portion of what you received to dad. And so they reluctantly looked through their stash, and finally they gave me one piece out of their stash, right? The broken candy, the candy they didn't want, Almond Joy, the spiciest candy that they couldn't eat, right? And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, do they not know? I mean, I literally could go to Target and buy so much candy that it would rain on top of their heads, right? I mean, I could literally go, and while they're eating this bite-sized Snicker bar, that I could eat a big one in front of their face. Do they not know that, right? But I used a little wisdom in that moment, and I just stayed calm and said thank you. The next morning, I woke up a little bit earlier, and I decided to scour the house for as much candy as I could find. In fact, I found 2 bags worth of candy. And so what I decided to do with that candy was I decided to fill their buckets and actually double the amount of candy in each one of their buckets, because I wanted them to understand and know this law of the harvest. I wanted them to know that when they give, even their piteous form of what their giving was, that I wanted to bless them, because when they give, they should receive. This is the principle that I believe that God is teaching us. The reality is that you cannot outgive God. You cannot. When you give, you are connecting your faith with God's faithfulness. Let me say that again. When you give, you're connecting your faith with God's faithfulness. And as that comes together, it wasn't even about your money in the first place. God doesn't need your money. He wants your heart. See, Matthew 6 actually talks about that, right? He says that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And this is such a good passage, because I've always even preached upon it to say that actually, if you want to know where your heart is, then look at your checkbook, look at your credit card statements, look at the things that you spend it on, and you will find where your heart is. And it's a good examination of where our heart actually is. But here's the thing about that. The opposite part of that is true as well. The opposite is true in the sense that sometimes our heart is actually not on the things that God wants and desires for us. And so because of that, what we need to do is we need to put our treasure there so that our heart will actually follow. Some of you might be in stocks and you invested in a certain company, and you had no care about this company before until you started investing in it, until you put your treasure in it. Now, when you put your treasure in it, you start researching, you start caring about it, because your heart follows your treasure. And what God is saying with this passage is that sometimes we need to actually put our treasure somewhere where our heart really needs to be at. And that's actually putting it and investing it in something that has value, something that will last way beyond ourselves. You see, we need to pursue after things that are not temporary, but eternal. Because all of us, we play this game of life. And we play this game of life, and some of us play it really well, and it's not a bad thing to actually play this game of life. But here's one thing to remember always as we're playing the game of life, and that is that everyone's game ends. He who has the most toys might win, but at the end of the day, he still dies. Because at the end of the game of life, it always ends for everybody, and you cannot take it with you. In fact, I've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul before, right? You cannot take it with you. That's why I love what God has done through you through the Moving Forward campaign. And what God was doing through you, that so many of you gave so generously to something where it would make improvements to the house of God, by the way, right? And because you get this principle that you could have used that money, hard-earned dollars, you could use that money for your own efforts and for your temporary things that you can enjoy in life. And that's not a bad thing. At the same time, many of you sacrificed those things and gave way beyond to actually things that will last an eternity. That you would actually give towards something that go way beyond your lifetime. That's an ROI, a return on investment that you cannot calculate. And so that's what we're talking about, that so many times we hold on to the things of this world so tightly. We have this posture that we hold on so tightly that so many times God can't even give us anything because we're not even in the posture to receive. See, here's the reality, that because we are spending all of our energy in this world, with the grip of the world, making the most monopoly money, that's what we're living with today. Because when we think about today, that we are truly in a momentary blip in the lifetime of eternity. And that's what we've been investing in. Randy Alcorn says this. He says, I'm convinced that the greatest deterrent in giving is this: the illusion that earth is our home. Think about this for a second. Let's say you went on vacation and you rented your hotel room. And you go into your hotel room and you decide, I want to rearrange this furniture. In fact, I want to buy some new furniture. I want to paint the walls because it's not the color that I like. In fact, I want to make this my place, right? Like, you would never do that in a hotel room. Or if you rented a car on a business trip and you actually took that car, and before you returned it, you actually got an oil change on that car, on the rental car, and you got new tires on that car before you returned it, you would never do this, right? We would say that's so ridiculous. Why is it ridiculous? Because we know that hotel room and that rental car is temporary. It's on loan for us. It's used for a short time. And yet when we think about the things that we possess in this blip, it's the same thing. That we have to remember that just like in the game of Monopoly, when you acquire, when you negotiate, when you barter, when you build it all, at the end of the game, there is a winner, and usually it's me, but there is a winner. And at the end of the game, after everything that you've done to be able to work at all those things, it all goes back in the box. It all goes back in the box because you can't keep any of it in real life. Because at the end of your life, you will keep nothing. In fact, my friend was reminded of this when he came home from his dad's funeral one day. And as he came back from his dad's funeral, he walked into the house, and the first thing that he saw was his dad's wallet that was sitting on the kitchen counter. And he was reminded that his dad gave his life in making the most money, and yet it was just sitting there, and he couldn't take any of it with him. Because at the end of the game of Monopoly, it all goes back in the box. And because we are so consumed with the acquisition of this thing in this game of life, that we forget that this Monopoly money is just money that we have here on earth. So how ridiculous would it be if we spend all of our time, our energy, and our effort to be able to say, I've got the most Monopoly money, right? As Matthew 6 says this, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So, what do we have to ask ourselves? What matters most? What's worth giving your life to? And are you living a life before God in such a way that when that moment comes, that you will look back on your life with wise choices? Or will you look back going down that road and looking back of a bunch of regrets? So today, you receive some Monopoly money coming in. Go ahead and take it out. And you can look at your Monopoly money. In fact, if you're online, you can go grab your Monopoly money in your Monopoly box. And take a look at this, and you might look at other people and say, well, they got more money than I did. And here's the thing about this. Everyone got different denominations because God is entrusted to us differently. But here's the thing. You might look at somebody and says, well, I got more money than you. It's like, who cares? This is Monopoly. It's not your money, right? This is not your money. And what I would like for you to do is there's a pen in front of you, and or grab a pen somewhere, and maybe if you don't have one right now, you can do this when you get home. But I would love for you to write something on the back of this money that you will remember and that might change your perspective in your life. This is what I want you to write on the back of this money. It all goes back in the box. It all goes back in the box. Put it in your purse. Put it in your wallet. Put it somewhere where you will be reminded when you actually take money away that you will have the eternal perspective and you will have that reminder, not as a remainder, but as a reminder of who God is and what this all means. Here's the interesting thing about this, that as you do that, like I did this many, many years ago, about 10 years ago, and 10 years later, somebody came up to me and said, I want to show you something. Took out his wallet, took out this Monopoly money that was 10 years old. It was all ragged, and you probably need some new Monopoly money there. And he showed me the back, and it said, it all goes back in the box. And he said, this has been so helpful as a visual reminder for me. And I wonder if we need to be reminded that it's the eternal perspective that we need to have, that actually it is to put our trust in God and not in this. The ironic thing is that the real money that we have, it actually says who we need to put our trust in. In God we trust. And it is a reminder that we need to do that in our lives. You might hear that Jesus talks about money. You might have heard this, that Jesus talks about money more than heaven and hell and prayer combined. In fact, some of you might be thinking, why in the world are we talking about money in church? It's because Jesus actually talks about it way, way more than any other topic. And so why is that the case? Because it's not actually about money. It's about what consumes us. It's what has a grip on us. It's what we're striving for. And at the end of the day, if we're seeking happiness and security and worth on anything else besides God, it's something that God wants from you. So the question is, what needs to change about our attitude around money? What decisions do we need to make because of it? What do we need to do because all of it goes back in the box? Because this life is so temporary, and the momentary blip on the timeline of eternity, do you want to invest in this momentary blip of a mist of a life that will be one here day here will be here today but gone tomorrow? Or do you want to invest in eternity? See, living a life on mission is not just about gathering purposefully, connecting deeply, serving selflessly, but it's also about giving generously way beyond ourselves. And the thing about it is, God doesn't need your money. God doesn't want your money. He wants your heart. Because our hearts are the things that hold sometimes these things that are not right. I think about this church and how God has continually blessed it and how it is made up of so many generous people. And I want us to always have this perspective as we look at life, that making sure that we loosen our grip on those things, that we would make a commitment, make a plan towards making sure that we have our eyes on the right prize, that we have the right perspective, because here's the thing, God can do way more with your 90% than you can do with your 100%. Because you're inviting God into your finances. You're inviting God into your life. You're saying, God, hey, take control. I trust you. This is what I love about what one pastor says about grip, and this is how I'll close. Look at your hands when you were just an infant. You came out with your hands closed, and every time someone put their little finger by yours, you would grab onto that little finger and you would hold it tight and you wouldn't let it go. And then as a toddler, you started grappling rattles and little toys, and when another kid came your direction and wanted them from you, you said, mine, and you took it away from them and you held it on tighter. And when you were in junior high, you hung on tightly to the bicycle bars and to the batons and to other things. In high school, you hung on to the hand of Betty Lou, and you would not let that go. And in college, you hung on to a lot of different things, maybe stuff that we don't even want to talk about here today. But when you left, you were clutching a diploma with two hands. When you started your career, you grabbed onto the lowest rung on the ladder and you hung on. And then you reached for that second one and you hung on. And then to the next one. And then you were climbing ladders and clutching rungs. And someday, retirement will come and you'll hang on to golf clubs and gardening tools, pension funds and Social Security. When you get to the end of your life, you'll start hanging on to canes and walkers. And then do you know what happens to someone in the final moments of their life? They clutch onto the side and the edge of a hospital bed, and they hang on tightly as if it was life itself. And then they die, and finally, they relax their grip. And I think that's so true in our lives, that this world has such a tight grip on us. And when we're holding our fist this way and we're holding on to those things so tightly, it doesn't give us the posture to receive what God has for us. And so I wonder what it would look like. Imagine what it would look like if we were a growing community that was actually trusting God with their lives. That we were actually giving not out of the remainder of what we got, but as a reminder to say, hey, you were the one that gave me this in the first place, God. Imagine what it would look like if we actually lived our lives in such a way that we no longer fell into the mist, but the truth to say, this is what we hang our happiness and our security and our worth in, because He is the unchangeable. He is the one that we can rely on and trust in. So how would that impact the way we live, the way we save, the way we give, the way we spend, the resources that God has entrusted to you as stewards and as managers? What would that look like? Because church, we can do this. We got this. And we got to let go of this grip, because the reality is that it's got a grip on us. And so we got to decide to live a life on mission and to give generously as we gather, connect, and serve. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for just the reminder today that so many times we forget. And we think that this life is all that it's about. But help us to remember the eternal perspective that this life is just a momentary blip on the timeline of eternity. And that as we invest in the things that matter the most, that as we have a plan and a commitment towards that, that you would see our generosity, not because you need our money, because you care about our money, but because you love and care about our heart and our trust that is placed in the right direction. And so lead us, help us remember this in Jesus' name. Hey, let's all stand up and sing this last song.